Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. You guys gave us a case that we are really excited to dig into today, the story of Terry Hyatt. So we've got a pretty thick stack of articles here, court documents, even some personal notes that we're going to try to sift through. And this one's a bit of a winding road, so get ready for some twists and turns along the way.
Yeah, it's a really interesting case, Heather, because it gives us a glimpse into how the criminal justice system works, how forensic technology has changed over time, and also just the lasting effects that these types of crimes have on, families and entire communities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a good place to start is with Terry Hyatt himself. He was born in Asheville, North Carolina in 1957. And in your notes, you mentioned that his childhood seemed pretty average, but were there any signs early on, any red flags maybe that something was off?
Yeah, so Hyatt had a learning disability, and it sounds like he had some difficulty connecting with other people. And, those types of factors can sometimes contribute to antisocial behavior. But, and I want to be really clear about this, they absolutely do not excuse or predict criminal acts.
No, of course not. Right. It's important to make that distinction. But he did have some early run-ins with the law, right?
He did. There was a purse snatching incident and even a brief escape from prison. And this raises a really interesting question. At that point, did anything about Hyatt's behavior set off alarm bells for anyone? Or were these incidents just seen as isolated events? Because it's always so fascinating, to think about how early behaviors might hint at later actions.
Yeah, hindsight is always 2020 right. But in the moment, it can be much harder to see the bigger picture. And sadly, things escalated quite a bit from those early offenses. We're talking about 3 murders here, each one more disturbing than the last. The first victim was Harriet Simmons, a 40-year-old mother of 7. It's 1979, she's on her way to Tennessee, and then vanishes without a trace.
Yeah, and her car was later found abandoned at a rest stop. And it wasn't until a year later that her remains were finally found. Oh, and this is an interesting detail. Initially, there was a false confession from Henry Lee Lucas.
Oh, wow. I vaguely remember reading about that guy. Wasn't he a notorious serial killer who ended up falsely confessing to a ton of murders?
That's him. He was kind of infamous for inserting himself into these high-profile cases, adding another layer of confusion to the investigation.
Right. So right from the beginning, this case is already shrouded in mystery and misinformation. Then there's Betty Sue McConnell, a 21-year-old working at Dunkin' Donuts. I remember reading in the court documents that she was on her way to meet a friend when she disappeared. What happened next?
Her body was found a few days later near the French Broad River. She'd been stabbed multiple times. Another young life just brutally cut short, seemingly chosen at random.
And finally, there's Jerry Ann Jones. She was a 19-year-old cashier at Harris Teeter, gone from the parking lot, found murdered the next day. But what's really strange about her case is that it went cold for years. Nobody knew what happened.
It's chilling to consider the similarities between these cases. All 3 victims were women, seemingly targeted at random, and all the attacks took place in isolated locations. It really begins to paint a disturbing picture.
Yeah, it's a pattern that unfortunately even started before the murders. There was the case of Carolyn Brigman. She was walking home from Krispy Kreme when Hyatt tried to kidnap her at knife point.
That attempted kidnapping is particularly fascinating. It's almost like a precursor to the murders, a glimpse into the darkness that was to come.
Yeah.
You have to wonder, could this have been a turning point, a chance for intervention? Because Brigman's description of Hyatt in his truck ultimately led to his arrest and conviction for the attempted kidnapping. So it raises all these questions about the nature of escalation, and what could have been done differently.
Yeah, almost like a missed opportunity.
Right.
And then after that, things go quiet for almost 20 years. It's like Hyatt just disappears. And then, seemingly out of the blue, he's arrested for the murders of Simmons and McConnell.
Well, the arrest was actually triggered by a confession from one of Hyatt's friends, a guy named Jerry Leon Harmon. He walked into the sheriff's office and confessed to his role in McConnell's murder. Said he was there that night and implicated Hyatt in the crime.
Wow. I mean, what a twist. So after all this time, it was his own friend who turned him in.
And it wasn't just Harmon. Another friend, Lester Dean Helms, also came forward with information about Simmons' murder. It's almost as if, after years of silence, the truth finally started to unravel.
So the trial begins. What was the defense's strategy? Did they try to discredit these confessions?
Absolutely. The defense argued that there was no physical evidence directly linking Hyatt to the murders, and they said that the testimonies of Harmon and Helms, given their own pasts, were unreliable, trying to create that element of doubt. Could these confessions have been coerced? Were they motivated by something else? They wanted the jury to consider all those possibilities.
Yeah, it really makes you think about how much weight is placed on the word of these witnesses, especially when their own histories are so complicated. So, how did the prosecution counter that? I mean, did they have any evidence beyond those confessions?
Well, they really hammered home the point that Harmon had no obvious reason to lie, you know,
Hmm.
to put himself in a position where he could face serious consequences, potentially even the death penalty. And his detailed account of what happened, along with the information from Helms, really painted a pretty convincing picture for the jury.
Okay, so it sounds like a real legal tug of war there, right? Trying to weigh the credibility of these witnesses against the lack of that concrete physical evidence. So, what happened? How did it all play out? What was the outcome of the trial?
Well, after all the arguments and all the testimony, the jury decided to convict. They found Hyatt guilty on all charges, and ultimately he was sentenced to death. And I think for the victims' families, after waiting for justice for so long, that decision must have brought a mix of, well, probably a lot of emotions, relief maybe, and a sense of closure, but also a lot of sadness.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't even imagine what they went through. It's heartbreaking. But in your notes, you mentioned that this isn't where the story ends, right? Even with this conviction and sentencing, this case still had another surprise in store.
Yeah, in 2005, almost 2 decades after that initial trial, there was a major development in Jerry Ann Jones's case, the one that had gone cold for so many years.
Mm.
Well, advances in DNA technology meant that investigators could take another look at the evidence.
Ah, okay, so this is where that cigarette butt you talked about comes in, right?
Exactly. They tested the DNA on that cigarette butt, and guess what? It matched Terry Hyatt. And to make matters even more conclusive, they also found traces of Hyatt's semen at the scene. So all of a sudden, there was this undeniable physical link between him and the murder of Jerry Ann Jones. It's actually a pretty incredible example of how, even years after a crime, forensic science can still provide those crucial answers.
It's like even though he was already in prison, the past was still catching up with him in a way. So what happened next? I mean, did this new evidence lead to another trial?
It didn't. Hyatt actually decided to take a plea deal to avoid another trial, potentially another death penalty trial. So instead, he was given an additional life sentence, which meant, no matter what happened with the appeals for the first case, he'd spend the rest of his life behind bars.
Okay. So, legally speaking, I guess that's the end of the story, right? The case is closed. But it leaves us with a lot of unanswered questions. You brought up the possibility that there might be other victims out there. And knowing what we know about Hyatt's history and, well, the way he operated, it's a chilling thought, honestly.
It is, and investigators and, well, researchers too, are still looking into that possibility. They're constantly poring over those cold cases, trying to find anything that could connect Hyatt to other unsolved crimes. And I think it's important to remember that for the families, the victims, this isn't just an abstract question, The
Right.
thought that there might be others out there who suffered the same fate, I mean, it's got to be incredibly difficult to live with that uncertainty.
Absolutely. This case goes way beyond a simple retelling of the facts, right? There's so much more to unpack here. And I think one of the most fascinating aspects is the psychology of someone like Terry Hyatt. Trying to understand what might have driven him to commit these horrific acts.
Yeah, trying to get inside the mind of a killer. Always a tricky thing. And to be honest, a little unsettling too. But if we want to prevent these kinds of things from happening again, we have to try to understand the why, you know. But it's not about making excuses. It's about getting a clearer picture of the dark side of human nature.
So, where do we even begin to unpack something like that? What are some of the things that experts look at when they try to understand individuals who commit these types of crimes?
Well, for starters, we know that Hyatt had that learning disability that made it really hard for him to connect with people. And some experts believe that when you have those early struggles with social interaction, those feelings of isolation and potentially even resentment, it can kind of set the stage for antisocial behaviors later on. It's almost like a domino effect, right? Where early experiences shape how someone views the world and how they interact with people.
Yeah, it's like a foundation. If it's cracked or uneven, the whole structure is going to be off in some way. But how do we get from social awkwardness to, well, murder? What's the missing link there?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? And it's important to remember that there's no simple answer. No, one-size-fits-all explanation. There are a lot of different theories about why someone becomes a serial killer, but none of them can fully explain it. However, research does suggest that there are some common psychological traits and behavior patterns that are often seen in these individuals.
So it's more like a combination of factors then, right? Maybe some predispositions, maybe certain experiences, and somehow they all come together in this really dangerous way. Can you give us an example of some of those traits or patterns?
Sure, a really common one is a lack of empathy. The ability to understand or relate to the feelings of other people,
Mm.
they just don't have that. And without that, it becomes a lot easier to inflict pain and suffering without feeling any guilt or remorse.
Mhm.
Another common factor is a need for power and control. And that often stems from feeling powerless or inadequate in other areas of their lives.
Oh, I see. So by controlling their victims, they're trying to like compensate for those feelings of inadequacy.
Exactly. The act of choosing a victim, dominating them, controlling them, it becomes this really twisted way of asserting their power. And it reinforces their sense of self-worth. And often, the more random the victims seem, the more it feeds into that sense of power. Like they're playing God, deciding who lives and who dies.
God, that's a terrifying thought. It's like they create their own world where they make the rules where consequences don't apply.
You got it. And that's one of the reasons why these cases are so difficult to understand, let alone prevent. Because these individuals, they're operating outside the bounds of normal morality. Their compulsions and desires, they defy rational explanation.
It's like trying to make sense of something that's completely illogical, something that's just fundamentally wrong. But we've talked about the killer, the victims, the evidence, the psychology. What about the community? Asheville is known for its beauty, for its art scene. How did these crimes affect the social fabric of the city?
Oh, the impact was profound. I mean, imagine living in a place known for its peacefulness, for its sense of community, and then suddenly you're confronted with this horrifying truth, a predator in your midst. It really shatters that feeling of safety and security that binds a community together.
It's like this violation, right? A violation of that sense of trust and security.
Yeah, and it leads to fear, mistrust. Parents are suddenly afraid to let their kids out of their sight. Women are constantly looking over their shoulders, and this feeling of unease just settles over the entire city.
It's like a dark cloud has settled over everything, a constant reminder that even in the most beautiful places, there's still darkness lurking.
And for the families of the victims, it's just devastating. They're not only dealing with the loss of their loved ones, but also with the whys, the how could this happen, the questions that never seem to go away.
It's a weight that they carry with them, probably for the rest of their lives.
Yeah. And beyond those immediate families, these crimes also affect law enforcement, the justice system. The pressure to solve the case, to bring some kind of resolution to the community, it's immense. And when a case goes cold, like what happened with Jerry Ann Jones, it just creates this lingering sense of frustration, of things being left undone.
It's like an open wound that never quite heals. A reminder that justice is delayed, maybe even denied. But when Hyatt was finally caught, when he was convicted, did that bring any sense of closure? Did it feel like things had been set right, at least in some way?
For some people, I think it did. Knowing that he was behind bars, that he couldn't hurt anyone else, that brought some comfort, some sense of, yeah, closure. But I think for others, those questions lingered. There are people who believe that the death penalty was the only appropriate punishment, the only way to truly balance the scales.
That age-old question, right? Justice versus revenge. Does taking another life, even in response to such horrific acts, really bring closure? Does it really solve anything?
Yeah, it's a question that we as a society are still grappling with. There's no easy answer. I think we all have to come to our own conclusions about the death penalty, about what justice means, about whether people can truly change and, be rehabilitated. Some people feel strongly that the death penalty is necessary to deter these kinds of crimes, to make sure that those who commit the most heinous acts face the ultimate consequence. Others believe it's just barbaric, state-sanctioned murder, and that it doesn't address the root causes of violence.
It's a complicated issue, a lot of different perspectives, strong emotions, but I think it's important to have these conversations, to really think about these things carefully and with respect for everyone's viewpoints.
You're absolutely right. And at the end of the day, it's important to remember that regardless of where we stand on the death penalty, the families of the victims are the ones who truly bear the weight of these crimes. They're the ones who have to find a way to live with the pain, to honor their loved ones, and to rebuild their lives after such a profound loss.
It really speaks to the strength of the human spirit, right? To find hope and meaning even in the face of something so terrible.
It does. And it reminds us that even though we may never fully understand why these acts of violence happen, we can still work towards creating a world where they're less likely to occur.
Mm.
A world where we put more emphasis on mental health, where we address the root causes of violence, and where we build a culture of empathy and understanding.
Those are some pretty powerful goals. Goals that I think really honor the memory of the victims and give us hope for a better future. This has been such an insightful conversation. We've covered a lot of ground, but there's still more to discuss. In the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore the aftermath of the case, look at the questions that are still unanswered, and the search for answers that continues to this day. Okay, so we're back, ready to well, I guess finish our deep dive into the Terry Hyatt case, and it's been heavy for sure. But as we've gone through all this, it's obvious there's so much more to this story than just the crimes themselves.
Absolutely. We've laid out the timeline, we've looked at the evidence, the psychology, how it all impacted the community. But I think in this last part, we need to really dig into those unanswered questions, those things that still linger, even today.
Yeah, and one of those big questions, the one that kind of hangs over everything, is the possibility of other victims. We talked about it earlier, but knowing what we know about Hyatt, how he did things, and the fact that, well, some of these guys, they stay active for years, it's a pretty disturbing thought.
It is. It's the kind of thing that keeps investigators and researchers, looking over their shoulders. They're always going back to those cold cases, looking for anything, any little thing that could tie Hyatt to other unsolved crimes. It's a tough job, and honestly, it's often frustrating. But the idea that they might be able to bring some kind of closure to other families, to finally give answers to people who've waited so long, that's what keeps them going.
And it's a reminder that for those families, those victors' families, this case never really ends, right? I mean, they live with the pain of their loss every day. And to think that there might be others out there who went through the same thing, it's got to be a lot to carry.
It is. It really shows how far-reaching these crimes are. The impact goes way beyond the direct victims and their families. It affects entire communities. It leaves behind this fear, this mistrust. It also forces our justice system. I mean, it makes us ask those tough questions about punishment, about rehabilitation, about the very nature of, well, of evil, I guess.
And you mentioned the death penalty earlier. Hyatt is on death row, but that sentence has caused, well, it's been controversial for sure. Some people think it's the only just punishment. Others see it as, I don't know, revenge, not justice.
It's one of those issues it's deeply personal. It divides people. And I think you have to look at it from all sides. There's the moral side, the question of whether the state should have the power to take a life no matter what.
Yeah.
Then you have the practical side, like, does the death penalty actually stop crime? Or is it just, more violence? And of course, there's the emotional side of it, the need for closure, for some kind of payback, versus the possibility of forgiveness or even, redemption.
It's complicated. It brings up all kinds of ethical questions, legal questions, emotional questions. It's a lot. So, I mean, where do you stand on this? You've spent years studying these cases. What are your thoughts?
Honestly, it's something I've thought about a lot. And over the years, my views have, well, they've evolved, I guess. I think you have to approach it with nuance, with compassion, because there are good arguments on both sides.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it really comes down to what we believe the point of punishment is, you know? Is it about revenge, making someone suffer for what they did? Or is it about giving them a chance to change, to maybe even redeem themselves?
Those are big questions. I mean, they really get at the heart of our justice system, of how we understand human nature. And I don't know, maybe we'll never have all the answers, but I think it's important to keep asking these questions, to keep talking about it.
I agree. It's not always easy to have these conversations, but they're important. They make us examine our own beliefs, our values, and our ideas about what's right and wrong. And maybe through those conversations, by trying to understand, we can get closer to preventing these kinds of things from happening. A world where mental health matters, where we address the things that cause violence, and where we build a society that's based on empathy, on compassion.
That's a world worth working towards, for sure. And as we finish up this deep dive into Terry Hyatt, that's the message I hope people take away. This has been tough, a real look into the dark side of humanity. But even there, in the darkness, there's hope. There's the reminder that we have the power to choose a different path, to create something better.
It all starts with understanding. Understanding the complexities of the human mind, the factors that lead to violence, and the power of empathy and compassion to heal and transform.
Well said. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's giving you a deeper understanding of the Terry Hyatt case, the lasting impact of his crimes, and the questions that, well, the questions that we're all still wrestling with.
And keep the conversation going. Talk to your friends, your families, your communities. Share your thoughts, your questions, your insights. Together, we can create a future where tragedies like this are just a memory, a reminder of a past that we've learned from and moved beyond.
Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.